Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are talking national political news of the day. The elections are well, actually not quite over. We will, in the third segment, discuss one that is still pending. All but one of the congressional House races has been called. The one that hasn't is in our Central Valley. Not a whole lot to talk about. We're just waiting for the final votes to come in there. But we are left with now what's going to happen over the next 2 years. Of course, 2024 campaign starts up the way politics works these days, but everything is around, who's going to be running for president, who isn't. But even before we get to that, Nancy Pelosi, of course, will no longer be Speaker of the House as of January because the Republicans have taken at least 221, possibly 222 seats. And so they will be in the majority. But there is a question as to who is actually going to be Speaker. Now, of course, Kevin McCarthy, who has been the minority leader for all this time, was the presumed favorite, but there are a lot of really strange politics going on within the Republican Party, and there are conservatives that are threatening to kill his nomination for speakership if their demands aren't met. Meanwhile, he's saying, well, the Democrats will end up choosing the leader. And in fact, there are some Democrats who've talked about, hey, maybe we should nominate a moderate Republican and then all try to get in. We can choose who the speaker is. And of course, the margin being very thin, there are a lot of Republicans who are moderate who are concerned about being reelected. They know that they could lose in 2 years very easily, in fact will do so, and so they want to cover themselves and maybe actually try to govern over these next 2 years. And we'll talk about that in the second segment, because there is, of course, the Jim Jordan faction that wants to go in to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop, and there are other Republicans who are saying maybe shouldn't really be the priority. So we've got basically power struggles going on. A question as to who is the leader of the party. Trump has declared himself for president in 2024. DeSantis is dead quiet, won't comment on anything, not even the fact that Trump had lunch with a Nazi along with, he used to be Kanye, his name is now Ye, who is also running for president. They had a yelling argument about who would get to run for president. Crazy politics. What is going on with the Republicans in the House, Dave?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and so thank you for that setup. As most people realize that it takes a simple majority to get the nomination to be the speaker. So when they caucused fairly recently, McCarthy was able to he won in like a 188 to 31 vote with 5 GOP representatives in their caucus saying, basically no one, I don't support anybody. So that's like the general split, but that I think was, highly symbolic and not important. What's really important is getting to 218 on January 3rd when they actually have a floor vote. And there's a history of this being relatively almost always handled for the last 100 years. There's one exception. We could talk more about the history in a bit. I think there's maybe some lessons there. But the idea is that McCarthy has very little wiggle room because the 213 threshold, if the Democrats all stick together, if he gets less than 213 at any point.
218.
Well, 218 is that's what he needs to get the majority of the whole entire place. Yeah.
Right.
But so if the Democrats all stick together, and they just need 7 or what does that work out to? Sorry.
They'll need I guess 5 to get to 218.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But he'll have 222. Right. Yeah. So it's 5. I'm sorry. He'll have 222. We expect. He loses 5. He drops to 217, and then theoretically he's not getting that number that he's going to need to get. So there's definitely a challenge here. And so the question is like, what's the why? Like, why are they doing this when there's no other candidate that really is viable? And we have, he did have a challenger who was Andy Biggs from Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And the general tone of the dissent of these folks is that they need a leadership change from the status quo, because enough people have said like this, the sooner that this is the Republican caucus talking, that the sooner that everybody realizes that that McCarthy hasn't done enough for their base,
Right.
the better, right? And so some of the things that they're demanding are things like a rule change that make it easier to kick the speaker to remove the speaker. I think there's a technical term which is called vacate the chair, which actually that's how Boehner was taken down. Again, we could talk about that a little bit later.
Sure.
But the idea is that people are asking him for a set of sort of more hardline responses to President Biden and his administration. So besides that rule change they're looking for, they're also looking to hold hearings. For example, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, they're looking for budget cuts. There's a whole set of things that they're looking to do. So the short version here, and again, we get more into the details, but McCarthy is going to be, speaking with these dissenting representatives one by one, saying, hey, why is it that you're insinuating you would not support me, and what do I need to do? So like that's what he did, for example, with Marjorie Taylor Greene, where he said, no problem, you're gonna get committees back, like what Pelosi and the Democrats did to you. You're gonna get some committee seats back. And I think that legitimacy may have been enough for her support, because she's not speaking out against him, among other things. So it's gonna be a one by one fight to see if he could. There's 20 people that have said, according to Biggs, there's 20 people who have said that they're not going to support him.
Right.
But there's really only 5 that are like, I am under no circumstances going to support him. So that's what's at play here, is him getting that number, McCarthy being able to get that number down to that core limited set of people who are opposed.
And there are different agendas going on there. I'm Ralph Norman from South Carolina. He wants the deficit to be gone in 7 years, right? So he wants all the committees to be committing to cuts in spending, but no cuts to the military, which of course is one of the biggest, bloated budget items there. So basically, to cut up, and it's bizarre that they're calling for cuts in Social Security and Medicare when they are actually separately funded. But I'm not quite even sure how that fits into the deficit agenda, but and there's talks that they want to basically hijack. We're coming back to this spending limit level thing. They want that done this time around. Meantime, Democrats are trying to get what they can done this time around. They did pass yesterday. Well, we'll talk. Actually, we'll talk more about that in the next section. Yeah. But it's there is there's an effort to try to get as much done as they can over the next couple of months, because the question is is there going to be governing or not? And there are definitely conservatives in there that basically want obstruction, and they want just everything geared towards getting Trump back into the White House. I mean, that's what Trump wants. Now, of course, we've got other Republicans who want to be contenders as well, and they're a little bit concerned because it looks like the way everybody is talking, Gavin Newsom confirmed today that he won't challenge Biden, and probably none of the other Democrats will either. So it's really going to be Biden has to make up his mind pretty soon. So there's unity in the Democratic Party, but not so much right now in the Republican Party, because they've got this goofy situation with the Freedom Caucus, with people like Jim Jordan, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and the rest with their agendas. And again, those agendas will basically sink any moderate Republican who managed to squeeze by, with a bare majority this time around. And so the question is are those... Yeah, they can only afford to lose, even if they get this other one, 222, only 4 votes or 5 votes, in anything. So the question is, will the Democrats come together and choose one of the moderates and say, you get to be the speaker?
So this is such a wild situation because I mean I obviously we don't know what the future is going to hold, and we're not in the inner circle, and we don't converse with the staffers of these people, so there's no inside information here. But just as a practical matter, just as an observer from the outside, and just kind of seeing how things go. Uh, with the Democrats controlling the Senate and the Democrat president in the White House and the Democratic, vice president who can, prevent any kind of 50-50 split from going the wrong way, regardless of what happens in Georgia, because that's its own issue. What happens in Georgia here. The real question is what is a Republican speaker's agenda, knowing that nothing that they propose has a chance of getting to become law without compromise with the Democrats. So the corollary to, well, we have no power to impose our agenda, is we will set the agenda of the House. And like you said, I think you hit the nail on the head, that's it's a messaging exercise for the purpose of building support for 2024 ultimately, because there's some vulnerable Senate seats. People think Biden's vulnerable. Of course, if you're a Republican, you're going to think that. So that's their agenda. And so these are the things. These are some of the issues that are really getting pushed for McCarthy to push hard. This is what people are talking about. So securing the border. They're saying, look, there's 2 million people that crossed the border illegally this year. 1 million of them were turned away under Trump's rule, Title 42, which was a COVID emergency effort. So clearly something is up. Like there's a lack of leadership there. That's their position. The budget. The United States borrows about 40 cents of every dollar that it spends. People think that's not sustainable over the long term. They point to inflation as an indicator of that. Now, obviously, they're not a direct correlation. Inflation comes from the Federal Reserve deciding to print money because of extraordinary measures and a track record of the financial collapse of 2008 and then COVID. So that's a different issue. But the Republicans are clinging to that as an issue. Cut spending. Or look what happens. We get inflation. So they're saying that. Also, like you said, investigations into Biden. So chaotic Afghanistan pullout. People will just want grandstanding. They want to get the whole Hillary Clinton Benghazi thing, where it's like, look what you did as Secretary of State. This was ugly. They want to do the same thing. Look what you did in Afghanistan. I just have
but that worked so well for him last time. I mean,
it's terrible. Yeah, and so people are upset about Afghanistan, but the question is, does it need to be a circus? And the answer is no. Yeah. Like do an audit, do an evaluation, a study, but no, they want a circus because that's a team building exercise. And COVID-19, they want to grandstand about the lab leak theory and say, hey, look, we need to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. We're mad about Fauci. We're mad about, gain of function, et cetera, the Rand Paul line of argumentation. So they want to grandstand on that. And also, if you point to Virginia, what got Youngkin elected governor in Virginia, one of the things that people are talking about is how he stood up for parental rights in school boards to help determine the future of curriculum and what kids are being taught. That kind of bleeds over into some of the teaching DeSantis is talking about, classroom dialogue about gender and et cetera. So they want to investigate the federal response to school board meeting protests, which is supposedly the FBI was looking at people that were making violent threats against school boards. So they're saying that these are all governmental overreaches or governmental failures. And then even McCarthy said that he'd be open to a Biden impeachment. I'm sure that's just lip service because he doesn't want to do impeachment for political reasons, and this would be purely political.
It would fail. You without 60 votes in the Senate, it will fail. It has nothing to do with whether you're innocent or guilty. You just cannot accomplish this. I mean, what happened with Nixon was a fluke of history.
So literally, like the things that I just said, and there's one other one, accountability for Ukraine funding. So McCarthy has said, look, we're gonna support Ukraine because it's really important, but we can't issue them a blank check. And again, that's pandering to the base. It's pandering to these dissenting Congress members. And so you got this group of 31 that voted against him, maybe 20 that said that they won't, 5 that said they never would. And so really this is about leverage. This is about McCarthy saying on each of those 6 or so, 7, 8 things I just mentioned, this is about McCarthy sitting down with people one-on-one saying, what's your priority? What do you need from me? And so again, it's for messaging, it's for theatrics. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're going to see out of the House starting January 3rd.
Well, and then you've got the Senate, which the Republicans failed to take. Major failure on that part. Probably can blame Trump a second time, for making the difference on that, for picking really bad candidates, and pushing them through, including the current one we'll talk about in the third segment, and. And so you have, and then you have him sitting down with a white supremacist, Fuentes, and claiming he didn't know about it, just like he claimed he never heard of David Duke when David Duke endorsed him, and he didn't want to alienate that part of the vote in any close election. So it's so you've got that, but in the meantime, certain Republicans are speaking up and saying, no, that was wrong, including Mitch McConnell, but not Jeff Hawley. He's like, well, it's really none of my business who he eats with, blah blah blah, and Ron DeSantis, who's just dead silent in the whole thing, just not saying anything, and the rest. So you've got this battle, and people in the House really just don't want to deal with it, deal with that. It's like, okay, it's just, I mean, how many other times has Trump been accused of racism, right? That's their defense. And anyway, so the Republicans have got a problem, because they got to figure out exactly what are they going to be the party over for the next couple of years. They would have had the Senate if they had any kind of legislative plan, because Sununu would be in there with them right now. Well, maybe they wouldn't have the Senate. That's if Warnock wins next week. But still, they'd be a lot closer to it. And so, at any rate, you want to close this out real quick?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, big picture, that there's a blame game going on. There was no expected red wave. They thought he was going to pick up, that the party was going to pick up a tremendous amount of seats, maybe 20 or more. Instead, they're getting about 10. And so there's the blame game happening here, and we'll see. But without any other viable alternative person, it's not a question. I think it's not a question of if, but when the others come around here. Otherwise, we're going to have a major problem. It's only happened 14 times in history that they didn't decide going into that first vote. 13 of them were before the Civil War. And one of them took 9 ballots into February. So that's what's at play if these people really dig in.
I don't think I've made mistakes. I mean, every time somebody says I made a mistake, they do the polls and my numbers go up. So I guess I haven't made any mistakes.
We showed up and we demonstrated that we would not have our voices silenced by a Republican Party that across the country had a singular intention on suppressing the right to vote.
Some Democratic senators seem to imagine they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority. Nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking.
The Republican Party moved very far away from reality. And the fact that you got colleagues of mine in the Senate who refuse even today to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. How do you deal with that?
Joe Biden is the president we need right now. Battle-tested, forward-looking, honest and authentic. He has never forgotten who he is fighting for.
All right, so now we're getting back to Congress. As we've discussed, there is a split decision. The Democrats will retain the Senate. Election coming up to decide by whether it's by 1 or 2 margins. Right now, if Walker were to win, it would be 50-50, which is the slim majority that they've held for the past couple of years. What this does guarantee is that Joe Biden gets to continue appointing judges and justices, and that's and there are close to 100 vacancies right now, a bunch more expected to open up. So that that's going to happen. There's nothing the Republicans can do to stop that, because there is no House involvement. That's strictly a Senate function. So, but the question is are they going to obstruct, as they told Sununu, or are they going to govern? Well, there are Republicans who are saying they want to govern. They want to talk about compromise and the like, and they are passing certain things even now on a bipartisan basis. Now, the Defense of Marriage Act has been basically, if the House passes it, and they're expected to, has been repealed by the I believe they're calling it the Respect for Marriage Act.
Right.
It won't if Obergefell is overturned, as Clarence Thomas has threatened to do. It won't guarantee that you can get married in every state, but what the Defense of Marriage Act did was to undo the full faith and credit provision of the Constitution as it applies to marriage. Because with any other type of marriage, if let's say some states have common law marriage and others don't, if you get married by common law rules, the other states have to recognize your marriage. Well, after Clinton signed the Bipartisan Defense of Marriage Act in the 1990s, the states have not had to recognize same-sex marriage coming from other states. This law, if passed, will do that. It's not everything everybody wanted. People wanted them to codify that federally it's guaranteed, but the question is whether or not that's constitutional anyways.
Right.
The Supreme Court is not going to try to undo full faith and credit, because even if you see them as completely corrupt conservative activists, that would undo states' rights and so many things. I mean, then states wouldn't have to recognize each other's driver's license contracts or court decisions. So they don't want to undermine that. So that appears to have passed in the Senate it got past the filibuster with 12 votes from the Republicans. I mean, considering that no Republicans voted against the Defense of Marriage Act, and some Democrats did. It was pretty overwhelming. This is a major movement in history. So, and it looks like it'll probably pass in the House. So, so the question, they are actually passing a bipartisan bill there. Other things that look like are probably going to happen are they've averted the strike, I think really irresponsibly, against workers' rights. I wish President Biden had been involved in this much more ahead of time and put pressure on the railroad companies to do it. But basically, there was a threat of a strike, and Congress is going to pass a law saying you can't go on strike. It's similar to PATCO workers. If they tell you can't strike with government contracts with the railroads, because it would be paralyzing to the economy. It would just make the inflation and supply chain issues infinitely worse, and it would cause a lot of pain. So they're intervening, but it looks like, despite the fact that Biden was saying just vote for the deal that was negotiated, that the union rank and file had rejected all but two of the unions, and up and down. But Nancy Pelosi, actually, as one of her last acts, managed to slip through and get the votes necessary in the House to guarantee the 7 days of paid sick leave, which is extraordinary, and managed to get 3 Republican votes, which was enough to do it. A little bit of a question whether it'll get by a filibuster in the Senate, but with Rubio on board and a few other people, it probably will. So you've got some bipartisan stuff happening here. We'll see what happens with the spending gap bill and whether or not government gets closed and all of that kind of stuff. But, of course, in January, the Republicans will be the majority. Are they going to govern for 2 years, or are they just going to investigate it and obstruct for 2 years, basically as a 2-year campaign to try to get Trump or DeSantis or another Republican elected president?
Yeah, right. That's the $99 question. I think it was important that you pointed out that there was some bipartisan consensus, in air quotes, we'll call it, with 12 of the Republicans stepping into the fold on the Respect for Marriage Act.
Including, by the way, senators who had never advocated for LGBTQ rights ever.
Yeah.
I mean, so anyway.
I think it's notable that the debate was about was, in support of, it's weird to phrase it this way, but the opposition was saying, hey, we could get on board if, right? So these are some of the things that we're interested in. And so like the largest association of evangelicals and the Mormon Church, they've put out exceptions to the new bill, basically saying, well, under these circumstances, we would appreciate our religious liberties being protected.
Right.
So that's the angle, which is like, you guys.
Well, What it guarantees is that they don't have to marry people or be sued for it. They can't be punished for refusing to do marriage. So they're trying to get it out and carve it out of the Civil Rights Act and the rest. But they can't do anything about full faith and credit. I mean, this
Right.
questions to whether DOMA was even constitutional anyway. But anyway, sorry.
But you hit the nail on the head, and I appreciate you adding meat to the bones here, because what I'm trying to say is that's what they're supposed to do in the Senate and in the Congress. They're supposed to figure out, hey, these are my red lines. These are the things that are really important to me. These are the things I'd like you to include. Yeah, you have the control, you have the power, you have the majority, but let's debate and let's say, like, these are our core interests. And people never really like, not to say people, many people don't like the way the sausage gets made. When you look under the hood, to mix metaphors, you see that legislation is sometimes ugly, and you don't really like how they come to where they get to. But so this is showing that at least they can talk when it's something that's important to them. And so that leads me to you asked the question, like, can they govern? Can they work together? So one of the things that I have heard is, like, well, what's going to happen in the next few weeks? So one of the things the Democrats are considering trying to push through is a cannabis banking law, basically saying, like, look, we've got half the states in the country that have now made recreational or medicinal cannabis legal, but it's illegal for them to touch money or use the money system. That doesn't even make sense. So that's one of those things where Democrats are saying this is actually a priority, and whether or not they're able to get it passed in the next month or so, there's arguably a bipartisan arrangement that could be made. So it's by the Democrats.
You can make a states' rights argument there.
Like, let the federal government get out of the way and allow the banking system, which is federally regulated, to let states do what they choose. And it
passed, by the way, a form of marijuana legalization in Missouri, and a few conservative places. Oklahoma is like, a haven right now for unregulated cannabis growing. So anyway,
and Florida, people talk about how DeSantis's Florida was a true red wave. Well, they legalized a long time ago, or at least several years ago, maybe not that long ago. But the idea is that these issues do bridge. Everything's not just red or blue. That there's purple when you get to it. So another issue that's really big is this Electoral Reform Act. It's something that I'm pretty sure Senator Collins and McConnell have both said that they support it. And the idea is to kind of close the door to some of the, let's just call it, shenanigans or machinations of January 6th that they tried to. For example, one of the elements of this bill, because they'll need 10 Republican senators to beat a filibuster here. The idea is that Trump and his team tried to contest and overturn the last election. I know we didn't forget yet. But the vice president's role would not be, there's no power there. It's purely symbolic. Put that in law.
Which is what the Constitution says anyway. It was never supposed to be anything other than ceremonial. But
totally. And then also raise the threshold to contest the results. Right now, if one member of Senate says, I'm contesting the results, then they get contested. They want to raise that to like 20% to make it a little bit less likely that something like this will happen. Also, this is a key one. If if more than one slate of electors are put forward for that process, for the vote certification, that the slate certified by the governor would be official, and courts can perform expedited review. So that just to kind of do away with this plan of, we'll flood the zone, we'll make our own people. Like I think somebody who ran for governor, I think it was Wisconsin maybe, who said, like, if I get elected, there won't be another Democratic president, or I forget exactly the quote and the phrase. I hate to press that upon somebody, but the idea is that that they're going to try to prevent the legitimate will of the voters to present those electors to this process. But anyway, I'm mentioning this because the bipartisan Electoral Reform Act is something that, whether they can get it through in the next month, before Republicans take control of the House, that's a goal. But at least it's something where the Senate can work together. And then that leads to, well, where can they not work together? Where's the biggest rub? And I'm curious to hear your feedback on this, but the debt ceiling, Senator Manchin does not support raising the debt ceiling through budget reconciliation, which means that the Democrats can't just say, okay, look, we're going to have enough money available to run the government for the next 2 years as we project, putting the full faith and credit of the U.S. In jeopardy. So they don't want a showdown. They don't want and over the next 2 years it would just be a bad form if the government is actually going to shut down. And so the GOP is looking for spending cuts. And if they're saying Social Security and Medicare, which of course are, as we know, those are programs that fund themselves effectively, and therefore you can make minor calibrations and tweaks to the money they collect to keep them solvent beyond 2028, beyond 2033. Those are the years I've heard thrown around: Medicare 2028, Social Security 2033. Right. So you could just make minor tweaks and get that solvent for 50 more years, or however they choose to. Maybe not that long, but the idea is that you don't necessarily have to cut those programs, but that opens the door to, well, what are the Democrats willing to cut to show good faith that they, to work in a bipartisan way with Republicans. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge if they're going to try to railroad that through in the next 4 weeks to really come up with something innovative. Otherwise, then they're going to have to. It's going to be, with the new Congress, it'll be a real challenge.
Yeah, no, and the question is, what else gets passed? You did mention that the Electoral Reform Act, it probably is going to, because I think Republicans don't want Trump playing that game if he gets elected again, or anybody else for that matter. They want to shut that down, and the rest. So there are possibilities there, cuts, and the rest. But what else, is Congress going to be doing over the next couple of years? Well, obviously they got the Republicans. I think McCarthy is in a tough spot there, but he has to know that if he comes to power and then all of a sudden the war gains in Ukraine are reversed because they're not getting the weapons they need or the support they need, that's not going to look good. And they can only depend on inflation because because at this point inflation by this morning's report, it looks like the Fed is finally starting to have an effect in terms of slowing down job growth. Is that going to have an impact on inflation? We'll find out. But the idea that the federal budget is what dictates inflation. It's been increasing the whole time. We went through 15 years with virtually no inflation, with deficits being sent through the roof. So it's so we'll see what they actually want to do about it. But what can there be that is bipartisan in support and that they can show, because I think that Republicans do realize that they need to go into the next election. Part of the reason they lost this time around was McConnell kept insisting on a no policies discussion campaign. That is probably about as big a factor of fault as anything Trump did. So, is there chances for bipartisanship? The fact that the House is as close as it is, there are definitely Republicans in there that they don't want to be sacrificed. For the Republican agenda, especially a far right agenda, because they tend to be centrists, or at least right of center. And so it does seem like there are opportunities, but they're going to have to, obviously there's going to have to be a lot of compromise. And you already see people, I can't remember which of them said it, but, well, why are we the ones always compromising our principles? The Democrats have to compromise their principles too. But the fact of the matter is they're talking about like they've got to do this. They know that they've got to compromise and return to a system of governing, because it's just going to wear thin if they just keep blaming the Democrats now that they actually have power of one of the houses.
I'm with you that a rational actor would look back at 2020 election, look back at 2022 election, see the patterns here, and say, yeah, there's certain accomplishments that the Republicans were able to bring to their base during the Trump administration, but that now they're sort of that seems to be it's not clear that they have an agenda that is supported widely enough to pass. And so the question is, do they start to compromise, or do they continue to sort of self-identify as continue to self-identify as obstruction, like the McConnell plan that we've talked about? Is blocked an awful lot for an awfully long time. The idea is that they're going to prevent progress and contrast themselves to Congress, hold up Nancy Pelosi as that sort of, whatever you want to call it, San Francisco liberal caricature, and then just say like that's not how we should proceed. but that's not gonna bring Social Security and Medicare into solvency, and that's not going to be the way that you manage a conflict with an adversary like Russia, nuclear power. You need to be statesmen, and you need to be thoughtful. And the jury's out on if that's how the next Congress is going to pick up their moment in history.
All right. Well, we'll find out. Okay, as we discussed, the Senate is decided who's going to be the majority. The question is how much. We have a fascinating election going on down in Georgia. And as the joke goes, the devil is not going to Georgia. Trump has decided he's going to phone it in, so to speak. Everybody's begging him to stay out of it. Even Herschel Walker the other day. A lot of weird stuff. I mean, we thought that there was weird stuff happening during the natural part of the erection, as a certain candidate has referred to an erection. I got into conversations about werewolves, whether or not werewolves can kill vampires, and so he'd rather be a werewolf. I mean, just all kinds of strange stuff, and now questions as to where he actually lives, as to whether or not his actual residence is in Texas, and whether or not he even qualifies to be senator. Despite all of this, Republicans are, nobody is turning on him. None of the Republicans are endorsing Warnock. Even Kemp, governor-reelect Kemp, is still endorsing Warner because he's got the R by his name, and nobody wants to dare contradict that. So we have the special election because in Georgia, you need to have 50% of the vote or more before you can win an election, a statewide election, and probably any congressional election as well. And we have an election set for next Tuesday. It used to be held in January. Part of the legislation last year is Republican decided that's too long. Whether or not that was part of their effort to suppress votes or not, it means a lot less early voting time. Early voting is really important to some people because it's hard sometimes to get in to vote, and even with the early voting, there have been long lines. Republicans tried to shut down Saturday voting through a lawsuit based on a interpretation of what the law was supposed to be that they passed, but somehow they didn't apply it to special elections, only to the general elections, about allowing early voting on a Saturday following a holiday. Kind of an oversight on their part, probably will be fixed next year. But because Republicans do maintain the majority in the legislature there, and they have the governor to sign off on it. So we've got this election happening next week. Voting started on Saturday in several of the blue counties. That actually gave Democrats a head start. I believe as of Monday, almost half of the people who voted were black. Now I think it's like 38%, but still higher than their turnouts. And the turnouts are, if you check, you can look it up, several different sites. The turnouts are currently heavier in the Atlanta area and other areas that have been blue. Not everywhere, not Savannah. They need to do a little bit of organizing there, but they are breaking records every day. I think now we're at over 800,000 people have voted so far, and it's probably not going to get up to the midterm level. But man, that's a lot of banked votes for Democrats. Yeah. And the election continues. Walker didn't even start really get out the vote efforts until Monday. Warnock had like 8 events in and around Atlanta on Saturday. He's got Obama coming to help him out. So this is very crucial, because if the Democrats do win this one with Warnock, it gives them a little bit more cushion to deal with, Cinemansion and that, so to speak, at least one of them. So, lot to talk about with this election. Dave, I'm going to let you join in here.
Cool.
What do you got?
Well, yeah, I'm just going to pick up on that last point that you said that, Sinema and Manchin have an outsized influence in the Senate right now because every vote is necessary for them to advance anything. Whereas if the Democrats pick up this seat in Georgia, they get to decide the committee makeups, et cetera. So rather than having to split the committees, control of the committee. So there's a significant benefit. And so commensurate to how important it is for both parties, but in particular the Democrats, there's just an ungodly amount of money going in here. I looked it up. In the 2020 cycle, when there was $700 million spent in the Georgia Senate race, $500 million of that was spent between Election Day and the January runoff. So they did compress that runoff, but this race has still, for this cycle, is still over 300 million. 73 million of it came in just in the most recent reporting period through mid-November. And so obviously that's about 2 weeks ago, which means there's been a ton more. There's massive spending going on. My point is that since 2020, the citizens of Georgia have been just getting inundated with hundreds of millions, approaching actually $1 billion of political advertising. And this race, the reason that there's a runoff is because it was Warnock had about 49% and Walker had about 48%. There was 2% that went for an independent candidate approximately. So it's really razor thin here. And there's, early exit poll, which exit polls are notoriously uncertainly, in their accuracy, but around 5%. I think the number I saw was 6%. So that's close to 1 in 20 people say that they did not vote in the midterm. So there are people who are coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, to say like, oh, I realize how important this is, and I'm going to do my part. And so that's why I think that the GOP actually sued to block. Took it all the way to the state Supreme Court of Georgia to try to not have voting on Saturday, because this election, the early voting was going to be Saturday to Friday, and then the actual election is next Tuesday. So each day that they could keep, especially a weekend day, each weekend day that they could prevent people from going out was important to them. But the state GOP, Georgia Supreme Court did decide that they should have that weekend voting. So that's just big picture context, but just for like what do we expect? Well, as of now, there's only been a couple of polls that came out of Georgia. Warnock was ahead in one by 4 points. Walker was ahead by another by 1 point.
And dead even in a third.
A third. There you go. So it's effectively even with a slight bias to Warnock if you do the averages, but that's not weighted, et cetera. So it's really pretty much a toss up. And so the idea here is that without Trump out there saying, hey, don't go vote, and without Trump out there saying, go vote, he's just kind of on the sideline. That probably benefits Walker a little bit here because Trump being out. But Warnock is the incumbent, and there's a significant greater amount of money and effort going into Warnock's efforts here. So I think I mentioned this in one of our last shows, or I think it was even my prediction. I'm not sure. But I thought that, even though Kemp is out there taking the mantle of representing his party, the Republicans, I think that marginally less excitement, all things being equal, which is not rational, but I think that's the case. When there's a primary day, when there's an election day, like tons of people, there's lots of reasons to show up the local races and et cetera. This is a special event, so I don't think there's an advantage, even though historically in Georgia. The electorate is older, the electorate is whiter, and runoffs favor GOP. That's historically. But Warnock did win the runoff last year. So it's really, really close. And it's one of those things where there are very few. Here's the deciding factor here. This is my take on it, is that when you look at all the statewide races in Georgia in the midterms a couple of weeks, like 3 weeks ago now, there were more people that voted for Republicans, but not Walker. So there's a lot of Republicans who have already decided I am either going to not vote or I'm just not going to vote for him. And I think that might end up being the difference.
We'll talk a little bit about it. I even have something to add to that later, but I want to point out that right now, again, this is not necessarily the same because we know, as we've discussed, that same-day voting benefits conservatives these days. Didn't used to, but it does these days because of the whole line of Trump and Trumpism that early voting is bad, that it allows for fraud, your vote's going to get thrown in the river, whatever. And so right now the turnout is fairly low in the rural areas. And even with respect in relationship to the results a couple of weeks ago, there's a map you can go to, PBS NPR. I don't know what GPB stands for, but it'll tell you what percentages, what the turnouts are, and some of the best turnouts right now are in Atlanta and the Atlanta metropolitan area. We've discussed that as like one of the major areas of change for the whole state, and there's but the problem is that when you see long lines, that's good. It shows that there are a lot of enthusiastic voters out there if it's happening in a blue area, but it's suppression. Because it means they're not giving those precincts enough money to have enough machines to make that go quicker. And the longest line waits are on Saturday were up to 3 hours. On Monday and as of yesterday, I'm not sure about today, there were waits that were still as long as 2 hours in urban areas where the blue voters are. And that means that people are driving by that want to vote, but are saying, oh man, I just got off work. I got to cook for my kids. I can't wait in that line, right? You know, I mean, it is in effect suppression. And it's sort of a quiet suppression because not every state has a rule that you have to allocate money for machines and voting space proportionately according to the number of people in a precinct. They don't have that there. And so this is a big deal. However, the lines on the flip side of it is the lines indicate, at least among some voters, an enthusiasm. And when they're waiting on Saturday in 2-hour lines to be able to vote, you know that there's some enthusiasm about this election. And you looked at the lines that are on television, and probably 3/4 of the people are black. Again, this is part of what some people are referring to as Jim Crow 2.0, where you've got other things that are suppressing it, including real petty things, such as if you're within 125 feet of the building of voting, you can't distribute pizza and water because somebody who's been waiting there for 2 hours obviously doesn't know who they're going to vote for. And if you hand them a slice of pizza or a bottle of water, they're going to switch and vote for who you want to, even though you're not saying who you're going to vote to. They're going to read your minds. I mean, it is absolutely, they're calling them gifts. You know, in the stuff. So they've done that. They've added ID requirements, which, okay, you'll hear all the arguments about anybody can get an ID. If you're an idiot if you don't get an ID, but the fact of the matter is it disproportionately impacts black voters, poor voters, older voters, voters that are in the blue constituency, student voters, and the rest, because it's not everybody has a photo ID, and we can say it's real easy to get one, but it's more complicated than that. The life is not that simple, and the rest. So you've got all this going on. So the question, you know, but you've got the big lines as of yesterday. I haven't read any reports as of today, but as of yesterday, people were still willing to wait in line for 2 hours. But you don't have the waits in the rural areas. That could also be because they don't vote early, or maybe not being voted at all. So it's really hard to read what all of this means. But what we do know is there is enthusiasm among some voters. Maybe not all voters, maybe not all registered voters or everybody there, but one thing the Democrats can count on is they've got votes banked. They don't have to worry about getting them out on election day or later. Every time that happens, they are banked. This is, you know, and they got to be happy about how that's turning out. And Warnock's campaign is just very well organized.
Yeah. And you know, to a certain extent, I'm with you on the early voting being a good sign for enthusiasm, and all things being equal, knowing that that the metrics, the exit polling demographics working in favor of Democrats, you would think that that's an advantage. But I did look it up because I saw the number as of, you know, Monday, so the entire weekend total. It was only 181,000 voters in Georgia.
Weekend.
For the weekend, yeah, which is like just about 5%, a little less, of the total of nearly 4 million, 3.9 million people that voted in the midterms. So really,
but
it's
about 5 times the difference of the first election.
absolutely. Yeah. So I just want to bring up one other thing because it's gonna come up. There's gonna be a count, and it's probably gonna be close. And so once I start looking into some of these rabbit holes of what's a real clear politics, to its credit, covers a whole range of diversity of ideas. And so one of the articles that they posted was from the Federalist, an article by Margot Cleveland. She quoted an expert, Mark Davis, who's an expert in voter data analytics and residency issues, who filed a complaint with the Georgia State Board of Elections saying that he can prove that there are thousands of Georgians who voted illegally, both in 2020 and in 2022. And I'm not going to go down the whole theory, and it does play out that he's in theory he has something to say that about 25,000 people in net moved from one county to another, formally changed their address, but violated the law when they placed their ballot in the prior county. You could take that the next step and say about 4,200 people moved out of state and changed their address, but then still voted in Georgia in the 2022 midterm election. So you've got, once you start doing the math, you say, okay, well, it's not an insignificant number of people. It might not be a huge issue in a state of 4 million voters, but the fact that Biden only beat Trump by about 12,000 votes, there's going to be lawsuits, and there's data. There's a paper trail here, and so they're gonna what's the remedy going to be? There's probably no remedy. They're not going to have a re-election. They're probably not going to throw these votes out. But it's just going to add a little bit of fuel to the fire.
And then, who are they even? Do they necessarily benefit Democrats? I mean, people in rural counties move to other rural counties. People who are upwardly mobile move to other states. So, you got to be able to prove that it would have made a difference.
And they're not all illegal because, like, say, for example, you're a student and you go to school in one place, but you vote back at home. You're allowed to do that. So that's not illegal. But my point is just this, that there's a whole information ecosystem out there already challenging the viability of a confrontation, a dispute mechanism. So it may not end just because
it may not end, but I'll bet you whatever statisticals there are involved there are probably true in every state. But
absolutely. Yeah, the finer granular you look at the data, the harder it is to make a clean comparison, for sure.
All right. Well, next week we'll be discussing the outcome, maybe. Okay, that brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you got for us?
Well, I think predictably, my prediction based on our conversation today, I'm sorry if I'm taking the low-lying fruit here, but just everything that I looked at, the leader of the party that has the majority of members of the House of Representatives almost always becomes the Speaker of the House. The infighting for favors that has happened in the past to get leverage, that's going to continue. But I think all things being equal, once the dust settles, we're going to see Kevin McCarthy as a Speaker when they have a floor vote on January 3rd.
I think so too, just because there's nobody else anyway. They got to do it. All right, well, I'm going to do low-hanging fruit too, but I want to actually be real specific here. I am looking at this Georgia election, and yes, more conservatives will vote on election day, but there is an enthusiasm behind Warnock. I think the polls are messing up again. I mean, I think that one AARP poll probably has it right. I think not only is Warnock going to win, but I think he's going to win probably by 4 or 5 points. I think there's an enthusiasm behind him, a lack of enthusiasm behind Walker. And if Trump isn't going to show up, he's not going to. A lot of those people are just going to sit it out. I'm predicting that Warnock wins, and it's not going to be a nail biter. I think it's going to be by about 4 or 5 points. We'll see. Anyways, we'll be discussing that, of course, next Wednesday. Of course, we may not have the results by then if I'm wrong. But until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.